It began in the medieval city of Strasbourg when Frau Trophia stepped outside and began to dance. She went on dancing throughout the day and she simply could not stop. She eventually collapsed from exhaustion, and this was after many hours of crazed motion. But on coming round, she continued until exhaustion prevailed and a weary sleep took hold. By the third day, Frau Trophia again rose to bruised and bloody feet and returned to her dance. And after several days of violent exertion, she was bundled into a wagon and transported to a shrine. Narrating this interesting, peculiar phenomenon in his book titled The Dancing Plague, John Waller wrote that within days, more than 30 people had taken to the streets, seized by the same urgent need to dance, hop, and leap in the air. He said they danced with such mindless intensity, such that by early August 1518, the epidemic had begun to spread at an alarming rate, and the numbers of afflicted rose each passing day, so that soon at least 100 citizens were dancing with crazed abandon. It was not until a month later that the epidemic subsided, leaving many people bereaved and thousands more in the city and beyond, fearful and bewildered. Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, where we are going to explore a dimension of functional neurological disorders called mass psychogenic illness. This is a long-known form of functional neurological disorder. Whilst the episode that occurred in Strasbourg was one of the most vivid, it was not the first recorded epidemic of psychogenic illness. As Waller pointed out, as many as 7 bouts of uncontrollable dancing had occurred in various parts of Western Europe prior to 1518. Since then, there have been many historical examples of mass psychogenic illness, such as demonic possession in nunneries in Europe and among girls in Malaysia. There have also been sensations of suffocation in workplaces in England, hysterical outbreaks of toxic gas anxiety in schools in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Bangladesh, and illness following vaccination in schools in Jordan. Others include fainting and twitching following HPV vaccination in schools in Colombia, and breathing problems following the World Trade Center attacks and during the Gulf War. Amongst the cogent causes cited for outbreaks of hysteria is stress. For example, Waller argued that Frau Trophia's crazed behavior was most probably connected to the appalling state of Strasbourg's population after 3 years of hunger, wave after wave of deadly malady, and decades of spiritual neglect, exacerbated by her status as a woman. In this regard, he said, few episodes of mass hysteria come closer than the dancing plagues to define the outer limits of what our minds can impel us to do in conditions of extreme distress. Apart from hunger, other recognized triggers for mass psychogenic illness include confinement in intolerable environments, rumors of poisoning, fears of chemical and biological terrorism, environmental concerns about toxic foods, odors, and water supply, as well as strict religious, academic, or workplace discipline. The defining features of mass psychogenic illness are the rapid spread of the symptoms of the illness among members of a defined cohesive group, and for which there is no organic cause. It also usually occurs when there is a perceived threat which has some basis in reality. It is, however, important to note that the symptoms are expressed unconsciously and that there are no personality predispositions for this. Dancing is just one of the varied manifestations of mass hysteria, the others including convulsions, paralysis, tremors, contractures, amnesia, altered consciousness, headaches, and verbalization such as yelping, bleating, mewing, laughing, and screaming. You really can't make it up. There are, however, less dramatic presentations as nausea, breathlessness, abdominal pain, body aches, and fatigue. One particularly curious manifestation of mass hysteria, also preferably called mass psychogenic illness, is in the form of sleep. This phenomenon was vividly portrayed by Suzanne O'Sullivan in her book titled The Sleeping Beauties. There she narrated the story of Nola and Helen, two of the hundreds of sleeping children who have appeared sporadically in Sweden over a span of 20 years, starting in the early 2000s. Starting insidiously, O'Sullivan said the children initially became anxious and depressed before they stopped playing and withdrew into themselves. They then gradually spoke less and less until they didn't speak at all. And if they entered the deepest stage, she said they could neither eat nor open their eyes, eventually becoming completely immobile, showing no response to encouragement and no longer acknowledging pain or hunger or discomfort. Sadly, some of the children remained in this state for years. The victims of this phenomenon, named resignation syndrome, were all children of asylum seekers, especially of Yazidi and Uyghur extraction, and these are those whose asylum applications had either been delayed or rejected, although they had lived in Sweden for years in some cases. When they are given asylum, the children often gradually recovered. It is interesting that the syndrome does not seem to affect other refugees, such as those from Africa, nor did it occur in countries other than Sweden, these oddities pointing to a socio-cultural basis for it. This is why O'Sullivan said that the children were unconsciously playing out a sick role that has entered the folklore of their small community. O'Sullivan also narrated the anecdote of another mass psychogenic sleeping syndrome which emerged in two neighboring towns in Kazakhstan. This anecdote also illustrated the variability of symptoms that can accompany the disorder. Pointing out that the sleeping sickness had a very wide range of forms, she said some people lost the ability to walk or talk but didn't sleep. The presentation also evolved over the years, and O'Sullivan said there was no such thing as a typical set of symptoms because people became sick in lots of different ways. To illustrate some of the triggers for mass hysteria, O'Sullivan narrated the story of the high school girls in La Canzona in Colombia who, in 2014, inexplicably started fainting and convulsing. The outbreak began in one classroom and spread like wildfire and was still occurring and evolving by 2019. The factors she identified for the epidemic included the way many girls were cooped in a confined, overheated space, as well as their concerns that the HPV vaccine they were administered was unsafe. And to demonstrate how the illness could spread, she gave an account of the Havana syndrome, the contemporary outbreak which occurred among U.S. diplomats stationed in Cuba. They had started hearing unusual sounds in the forms of grinding noises, loud ringing, or high-pitched chirping. These sounds were subsequently attributed to a sonic attack, a contention that O'Sullivan dismissed. Rather, she argued that the circumstances for a mass illness to occur were rife in the U.S. Embassy in Havana in 2017, and she asserted that if a model for illness is vivid enough and the basis for the illness is sufficiently salient, it is easily internalized by the individual and then passed from person to person. Illustrative of the continuous evolution of mass psychogenic illness is the emergence of its most modern iteration as TikTok tics. A social media mass psychogenic illness, this emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it predominantly affected female adolescents who manifested with very frequent and severe tics in their arms, and these resulted in significant disability. Almost all affected people also demonstrated coprolalia or foul speech, as well as self-injurious behavior, making it a mimic of Tourette syndrome. Another manifestation of mass psychogenic illness is in the form of culture-bound syndromes. Amongst these are Hwa-Byung, a Korean anger syndrome, Jinati syndrome, a possession syndrome in Iran and Pakistan, and voodoo spirit possession in Haiti. There are also Dat syndrome in South Asia, Hikikomori syndrome, prolonged social withdrawal in Japan, Amok, which is bouts of mass murder in the Malay Peninsula, Koro, which is genital retraction in Asia and Africa, and Za, spirit possession in Africa and the Middle East. And also included are cultural startle syndromes such as Lata in Southeast Asia, the jumping French Canadians in Maine, and Miryiachit in Siberia. And this is not an exhaustive list. In his book Mass Hysteria in Schools, Robert E. Bartholomew attributed the propensity of mass psychogenic illness to erupt in schools to the fact that these institutions can be fertile soil for growth of rumors and social delusions. He explained that this is because the everyday adolescent world swirls with turmoil and passions, insecurities, jealousies, rivalries, fears, and suspicions. Bartholomew, not too politically correctly, also explained the female predominance of the disorder to what he said is the inability of women to handle stress. I'm not sure I quite agree with that. Although the manifestations of mass hysteria are varied, Bartholomew argued that there are some common symptoms across them. These included overbreathing, fainting, nausea, stomach pain, and headache. In exploring the cause of mass hysteria, he referred to the creative ways in which the human mind adapts to fear, uncertainty, and distress. He also placed the nature of each episode of mass hysteria within the context of its environment. He said, as isolated press reports, episodes of mass hysteria seem to have no rhyme or reason, but that when understood within their local context, they appear less strange. And at the heart of mass hysteria, in his view, are rumors, which he said spawn in times of uncertainty and fear. Bartholomew also identified 3 stages in the development of rumors, which are leveling, sharpening, and assimilation. And a common theme in the development of mass psychogenic illness in schools, according to Bartholomew, is the dissatisfaction of its victims with their circumstances. He went further to suggest that the students unconsciously deploy the phenomenon as an outlet for their frustration. An illustrative example of mass hysteria that Bartholomew narrated was the one that happened in a German village school in June 1892. He said this started when the right hand of a 10-year-old girl began trembling, and soon her entire body was shaking. And the next day, the hands of several classmates began to tremble for up to an hour, and with each lasting day, the malady lasted longer and longer. Another European example he cited occurred in an orphanage in Holland in 1673, where he said children would suddenly collapse and get a strange look in their eyes, tug at themselves, strike the ground, cry, yell, and bark. Furthermore, he wrote, the children would lie stiff and motionless for hours, and they have no recollection of the events when they came out of them. Bartholomew attributed this epidemic to the monotonous religious instructions and prayers that the students were made to undergo. It is therefore understandable that their symptoms resolved once they were placed with local families. Consciously or not, very effective strategy. Bartholomew also explored the community pressure that might trigger mass psychogenic illness, illustrating this with such examples as the episode that evolved in a Malaysian school. Bartholomew said the trigger was the way that previously sheltered girls are pushed from the nest too soon and sent to distant and suffocating boarding schools to be raised by strangers. He added that these schools had an all-work and no-play policy which fosters abnormal states of mind that reflect local beliefs in the existence of an array of supernatural creatures. And to show that the manifestations of mass psychogenic illness are often exaggerations of behaviors that are acceptable in the community, Bartholomew referred to the epidemic that transpired in a Christian missionary school in Tanganyika in 1962, now part of Tanzania. He narrated how this started when 3 girls sitting at their desks suddenly experienced an unusual feeling of giddiness and began to laugh uncontrollably, and at other times they wept. He argued that these behaviors had roots in the laughter that was an acceptable feature of Christian revivalist meetings that were very common at the time. From all the episodes he reviewed, Bartholomew drew lessons for society. For example, he wrote that as we enter the 21st century, there is a lesson here about the unintended consequences of replacing flesh and blood teachers with computer programs, and that there is also a lesson about the importance of teaching subjects in a way to which students can relate. It is interesting that whilst the roots of mass psychogenic illness lie in the victims, the factors that exacerbate them often lie in the community. This is further illustrated in the Belgium Coca-Cola fiasco outbreak of psychogenic illness. Robert Bellow narrated this in his book titled Medically Unexplained Symptoms, a Brain-Centered Approach. Writing about one of such episodes that occurred in Bornem in 1999, he said several school children became sick after drinking Coca-Cola that they reported had a foul odor. From Bornem, he said, the outbreak spread through Belgium and to other European countries, resulting eventually in the removal of Coca-Cola from store shelves and costing the beverage company a loss of more than $300 million. Bellow traced the reasons why the epidemic spread to several social factors. For example, he wrote of how first-line responders and emergency room physicians appropriately took the matter very seriously, and of how the media picked up on these concerns and reported the Coca-Cola poisoning as fact. Similarly, he wrote that physicians at the Poison Control Center were obviously convinced of a poisoning epidemic and may have unwittingly contributed to the spread by directing all callers to go to their physician or to a hospital. Making matters worse, he added, a physician called the Poison Control Center to ask if there had been any reports of hemolysis from drinking Coca-Cola, that's breakdown of blood. This, he said, prompted the staff to record hemolysis as a possible effect of drinking Coca-Cola, and the health minister picked up on this and mentioned it at a press conference. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this podcast. If you found it enlightening, why not press on the like button and also subscribe to the YouTube, iTunes or Spotify channel. Ahead of the next podcast, why not check out my book, Surfing the Brain, for more light-hearted neurology. And for the harder side of neurology, you want to check my website called Neuro Checklist. Until the next episode, however, thank you very much for your time.